When God sat down and created Australia, he dipped his brush in inky venom. No other continent on Earth was so generously blessed with toxic fauna. This was an established reckoning long before clean-chinned Buzz Waldron, a maths teacher on assignment from the flat-earthed Idaho, ventured southwards and took up a contract doing years 9 to 12 at Bangham Bridges High in the days before the municipal reforms. A huge early moon shining in the south-facing sky greeted him on the abrupt horizon when he arrived on the train from Adelaide, and stepping out onto the platform he complained of reckless swelling and said it did sting like crazy. He shook his arm and swapped his bags from hand to hand. He was met by Brian of the Triangles, who had been teaching Pythagoras' theorem to Year 7 boys for 20 years. "What's the matter with your arm?" the Triangles asked as they headed aftward to his car. The railway station boasted spaces for lines of buses, a taxi rank, and a car park in tidy sequences. "I think I was stung by something," said the American. It was his Australian dream. He first heard of Australia in a biographical note on the flyleaf of a Reader's Digest. Since then he had yearned for a south-marching sojourn. "Probably a Murrumbidgee bluebottle," said Brian. "They love Americans." He looked at the American and was intrigued by his comparative youth. The most notable thing about him, as nearly everyone remarked, was the sheer cleanliness of his chin. It was shiny and spotless, unadorned by either hair or follicle or blemish. Brian asked, "Does it throb?" meaning his arm, not his chin. "Well, yes," the American admitted. "Yeah," said Brian, now entirely convinced. "A Murrumbidgee bluebottle," by which he meant a grim-faced brand of native wasp armed by its creator with a bright blue balloon of nastiness just above its rectum. The American applied pressure. They drove from the train station to the house in the suburbs where the visitor would be lodged. Along the way, the Triangles, driving and watching the road only in a casual manner, could resist no longer and had to ask, "What was it like?" Buzz tried to gather the meaning. "Sorry," he said. "What was what like?" "Up there, I mean," added the local. Buzz was still comprehensively dull. The moon, said Brian. He spoke in triangles too. A, what was it like? B, up there, and C, the moon, the hypotenuse. He nodded to the big 20-cent moon on the edge of the wide Antipodean sky. Buzz admitted that he didn't know what he meant. "I bet you were pissed off that Neil Armstrong got to walk on it first, hey?" said Brian. There was a long silence as the car crossed one of the many bridges that had given the town its reputation, and as Buzz gazed windowwards in view of the rows of unspectacular standalone abodes on half-acre blocks going by in monotonous array. Then finally Buzz saw the error in the driver's awkward way. "Do you mean Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut?" said Buzz Waldron, the school teacher. "Well, I suppose it was pretty amazing up there," Brian continued. Buzz was about to set this aright, but before he could calculate it, they reached the nifty weatherboard, their destination anon. "3 bedrooms, said the Australian, "and the backyard goes all the way down to the creek." It was slightly picturesque, one could tell. There were willow trees in the dusk. Buzz was impressed by this rustic authenticity, and Brian helped him move in. In the bedroom, however, the one at the front, the main bedroom, was a fermenting nest of what Triangles called bindi ants. They were festive in the plaster. They were black and gold and terribly industrious. They came out in the evening. "Don't go near them," said the Triangles. "Do they bite?" wondered Buzz. "Too right they bite," said the Australian, and he related several stories of whole men devoured in their sleep by certain breeds of bindi ants, though this was more common, he said, in parts of central New South Wales. Fortunately, he added, they were easily rid. He located a tin of diesel in the built-in robe and demonstrated that it made bindi ants froth and vomit, and at length die in curly fits, a completely common death. Outdoors, in the long shadows and the burgeoning moonlight, the yard was somewhat overgrown. The path out to the clothesline was weedy and rough in the dark tangle. They went for a look down the rear. "You'll have to watch out for snakes," the Australian advised. "Really? What sort of snakes?" asked the newcomer. "Blacks," said Brian, "and browns, and coppers, and yellow bellies, and red bellies, and tigers, but the striped bunjawilli mainly." "Are any of them dangerous?" asked Buzz, naive. "Oh, deadly," said Of the Triangles. "They're all deadly, although most people who get bitten by the striped bunjawilli just go blind. There hasn't been a death around here for a couple of years." The American stood still, knee-deep in the black phalaris and ryegrass, and looked around with gathering apprehension. "Are there many of them?" he asked. "Probably," said Brian. "You'll need to keep a lookout, especially down near the creek. They won't come up into the house, or not very often." "There aren't crocodiles, though, are there?" asked Buzz optimistically. "Hell no," said Brian. Then he turned and gazed into the clouds of humming mosquitoes. "Not unless it floods." That next Monday, the quiet American journeyed to the high school, which sat in grey patter among the bungalows and gum trees. He was introduced to the principal, Max Candy. Max was known for his astute humour and the black eye patch over his left eye. Before the meeting, Triangular Brian explained that he'd lost his eye, Max, when he rode his bicycle into a swarm of native bees several years before. "They go straight for the eyes," Brian explained. "It is an honour and a privilege," Max chimed when at last he and the newcomer met. "Very glad to meet you," said Buzz, shaking hands in the American manner. "I was only a kid when the moon landings happened," said Max, "and I never thought I'd get to meet Buzz Aldrin. Wow." "Waldron," said Waldron. "I think it would give a man a unique perspective on life," said the principal, "to have walked upon the moon." You're thinking of Buzz Aldrin," Waldron persisted, keen to clear it up. But just then the bell went, and the corridor suddenly rumbled with students, and the teaching staff rushed to the staff room for cake and tea, and Max insisted they address the faculty together. He introduced the new maths teacher as a truly space-age man whose expertise was out of this world, and other droll allusions besides. Everyone noticed his clean chin. "Are there any questions?" Phillips from geography had one. "Why is it called the Sea of Tranquility?" he wanted to know. "I think there may be some misunderstanding here," Buzz began. "No, it's definitely called the Sea of Tranquility," Phillips insisted. "What I mean is," Buzz found his predicament embarrassing, "I think that some people may be under the wrong impression about..." Mrs. Harding, the Year 9 coordinator, spoke up. "Oh, leave him alone," she pleaded, speaking generally. "He must be sick to death of talking about the moon. I bet he'd prefer to tell everyone about Idaho." Buzz agreed. "Oh, shut up, Beryl," said Haynes from Environmental Studies, rude. "I want to hear about the moon." "Well, I'd be pissed off that Neil Armstrong got to walk on it first," suggested Mackenzie from Art and Craft, a notion on everybody's lips. Before Buzz could venture a reply, though, the lights went out and Principal Max mono-optic on a video spectacular footage of the lunar module Apollo 11 docking with the orbiting command module piloted by the lackluster Michael Collins. When it ended and the lights came back on, there was a round of applause. Then the bell rang and the faculty dispersed. Crowding at the sink, rinsing out their cups, the American was sidled by Bob Singleton from English. "Have you bought a hat yet?" he wanted to know, being hospitable. "A hat?" asked Buzz. "Oh, for the Hare Bears," said Bob. "The Hare Bears?" "The native hare bear, popularly so called. Phascolatos cipodorus. They live in the eucalypt trees. If one of them drops on your head, you'll know all about it." He noted the American's youthful curls. Contrary to expectations and all the moonshot memorabilia, he looked rather like the shaggy end of Simon and Garfunkel. The American smiled weakly. I don't see anyone else wearing hats," he observed. "Well, no," said Bob. "After a while you can hear 'em coming. But at first you wouldn't know it till it's too late. So I need a hat. For the Hare Bears." "A protective hat," said Bob. "They carry any number of diseases, hare bears. You've had your tetanus shots, I take it." "I'll have to look into it," said Buzz. Moving off to have a review of his locker space and desk, he was met by Beverly Barber from Economics. She asked for his autograph. "What do you know about hare bears?" Buzz asked nervously. "Oh, they love Americans," she reported. There was nothing in the tourist manuals about hare bears, but there was a warning about the mosquitoes and the blue-ringed platypus. The mosquitoes found ankles juicy and had been known to cripple horses, it said. The blue-ringed platypus was just a complete freak of nature. If one gets into your sleeping bag, you have approximately 40 seconds to find medical attention. There was no information about their habitat or appetites, however, and Buzz wondered if they were prolific. Bravely, one morning he decided to go for a walk. There was a path through some wild parkland down the road. Not far along, though, he was greeted by a huge sign carrying the authority of the local shire, and it said in bold red lettering, "Beware, stingers." He was suddenly paralysed. Stingers? Where? In the air? In the grassland? In the soil? In the puddles after the splashing rain? He felt like he couldn't move or breathe. It was a wild colonial impasse. He turned around and walked very carefully back home again. This was the beginning of a profound discomfiture. One night he dreamt of baleful insects by the droves. By the morning he had come out in a rash. He rang Brian of the Triangles, who recommended a doctor, Dr. Sparrow. He had a vacancy at 2:45 p.m. "Never examined an astronaut before," the doctor confessed. He gazed upon the bare rash professional in his curiosity. "I'm just a math teacher," Buzz objected. But Sparrow duly announced that he had an outbreak of Ferguson's bed lice, and that what might look like a rash is in fact a rabbit infestation. The maths teacher was horrified. "Bed lice?" he exclaimed. "Thousands of them per square inch," said the Sparrow. He prescribed a cream. "How do I get rid of them in the bed, though?" Buzz asked. "Soak your sheets and pillow slips in kerosene for a day or two," said the doctor. "That'll kill them, usually." "Usually?" Buzz walked out, shaking his head and muttering Ferguson's bed lice in a U-shape of American disgust. On the way home, however, just as he ambled, he was suddenly set upon by a cantankerous mode of magpie. This was a common fixture in the Australian landscape, but uncommonly attracted to shiny chins. Buzz was somewhat prepared for an attack of hare bears by this time, if it was to occur, but the swooping menace of a territorially insistent magpie, the Cracticus tibicen, a flurried mess of disagreeable tenor in feathery monochrome, came as a nasty interlude. It flew at him sunwards, flapping and diving, silent in descent, clawy with claws and beaky with beak. Buzz called out in dismay. The bird circled up high and then dived again, aiming to peck a hole in the astronaut's head. He ran, guarding his headscape with his elbows. He bolted the whole way home. Waldron had never considered himself a squeamish individual, although the comfort of numbers was a reclusive certainty. The moon might have been a cool repose after all, he decided, since at least it was free of crawlies. Idaho had its beavers and its woodchucks, and he'd once encountered a mulch skunk under an apple tree. But his Australian exchange seemed increasingly besought with God's most toxic afterthoughts. Ferguson's bed lice were surely among them. When he marvelled about them, everyone just said, "Oh, sure," as if the entire nation took them into account and washed their pillow slips in kerosene on a semi-regular basis. And not only were the local microfauna disagreeable, but the exotic flora, once introduced, took on a jaundiced demeanour as well. Beware, the locals did say, the innocent-looking Gibson thistle. It shines in the dawn with yellow aplomb. But if its spiky appendage should ever be trapped in your long white socks, the only known cure is amputation. There were acres of it adjacent to the bus stop. It is fair to say that this left the American somewhat unnerved. The triangles dropped around and warned him about the killer possums, and strongly advised him not to lick the frogs. This was only days before a traumatic encounter. It entirely snapped his cordial relocation. It had been reported to him at the morning assembly that several students had succumbed to the recent outbreak of the notorious strawberry slug, and the canteen had thus advised that strawberry pudding was off the menu. Max Candy was holding forth with warnings when suddenly a black arachnid as big as Neil Armstrong's ego wriggled into the ambience and lobbed with eight-legged melodrama onto the slender crest of Beverly Barber's shoulders. The American was sitting but several feet away. He leapt to his feet. "Holy blazes!" he screamed. A deep-seated phobia stuck up its head. Hysteria waxed its pallor. Alarm rang its bells. An icy chill gripped his beating heart. Pale, struck with the trembles, he scurried. The staff all turned around. So too did the spider. It gazed out from its hairy preoccupations and seemed to flex its mane of horror. The whole thing was magnified. It appeared to Waldron as if the monster was as wide as a handspan and armed with fangs of rare menace. His American instincts kicked in. He dove under a desk and almost begged in fetal consternation. "Spider!" he yelled, with his Idaho drawl. For her part, Beverly Barber made proper calculations. She brushed off the beastie and it scurried behind the cupboard. Singleton from English and Jenny from the secretarial staff had to coax pale Waldron from his hidey-hole with promises that the danger had passed. "It's huge," the American complained. "Well, it's a baby one," said Singleton casually. "But in any case, it's gone." He assured him that support staff had gone to fetch a rifle from the office in case it came back again. The rest of the staff could not fathom how a man who had once traversed the cosmos and braved the emptiness of space and the tremors of escape velocity could be so afraid of leggy vermin. He was in a desperate shadow. Principal Candy was far from sweet. "You need to get a grip there, Aldrin," he said, almost embarrassed for the man. The American had heard about the spiders of this latitude, but to actually encounter one in all its ferocity gave him the shivering ghiblis. "Lucky you didn't run into any aliens on the moon," said Mackenzie, implying cowardice. Buzz dusted himself off. "Look," he pleaded, "I'm not an astronaut. I've never been an astronaut. I didn't walk on the moon. It didn't happen." Everyone considered this confession in stunned silence. "I knew it," said Phillips from geography eventually. "It was all done in Stanley Kubrick's garage. There was an article in Time magazine about it." Triangles reckoned Buzz must have been carrying that dire secret for 30 years. "Gee, Buzz," he said, like a shocked colleague, "your entire life has been a lie. Conspiracy theorists had been right all along." Beverly Barber assured him that the truth would set him free. He hit a wombat on the way home. The marsupial was fine, but the car was mangled into a turbid shingle. He was later informed that there had been a recent plague of wombats and they'd pushed the local road toll to unprecedented levels. "It's best to swerve and slide into a wombat," it was explained to him. "If you hit one head on, it will win." Buzz was shaken up. His only consolation in these itchy days was the relative bedragglement of his classes. His students were too young for the moonshots and too ugly to each other to cause him anything but futile trigonometry. They cared as much for cosines as kids in flat-earthed Idaho. He kept a group of them in detention one day. Being teenagers, they marvelled at the cleanliness of his chin. "What can you tell me about Hair Bears?" he asked tentatively. "Well, I love Americans," said one. "Why are they called Hair Bears?" he wondered. "Well, they go for your hair," they told him. "They make nests out of it." "Are they related to koalas?" "Koalas aren't bears," they all said in unison, as if this fact was Australia 101. What a stupid question. A toothy girl named Doreen said Jono's sister was scalped by a hair bear once. "Isn't that right, Jono?" And Jono said it was. The Americans started wearing a hat. The sun in any case was vicious. If the hazards of the fauna were not replete, the sun itself was like a giant frizzle lizard, hot-eyed and fuming, stalking across the sky. In the bleached afternoons, chirping with massive locusts, he stayed indoors and strayed about the evaporative cooler until it contracted what the locals called coolies, some manner of indigenous microbe cursed with sulfuric digestions and gases lethal to human lung tissue. It breeds in the pipes, apparently. It's recommended you run a batch of vinegar through your evaporative cooler every 4 or 5 days in the hot weather. The Queen's birthday long weekend came and went, such that he dare not step outside. On very hot days, eucalyptus steam filled the air, ready to explode into sudden fireballs. Even after months, his arm still throbbed from the Murrumbidgee blue bottle. A local geologist working in the mines, Kevin Barrow, dropped in one day to discuss moon rocks. "I don't know much about moon rocks," Waldron admitted. "Yes, you do, Aldrin," said Kevin. "Why won't you share it with me?" He didn't believe that hooey about Stanley Kubrick. He was deeply offended. He said old-fashioned things about Americans and departed unfriendly. It became a widely held premonition. For whatever reason, the astronaut refused to share. It was deemed a contrary ethos. For some, it made him measly. For others, it only confirmed that the whole thing had been a confabulation of science fiction writers. This consternation continued deep into the irascible spring. He was once seen sniffing wattle flowers in the innocence of his front yard, appreciative of their honey tones. "You better watch out for the long-toothed butterfly," he was told. "It'll take your nose off." He looked it up. The long-toothed butterfly was a myth, the relevant book said, that it could take your nose off. More likely, it said, it inflicted a wound that soured quickly with black pus, and the nose had to be surgically removed. He looked up killer possums too. It said that it was a misnomer. They more often maimed than killed. Remarkably, Waldron survived the semester. His contract stipulated an industrious attitude and contained a clause relieving the education department of any misadventures. A history teacher from Canada had once been mauled by a wallaby and sued for trauma. Somehow Waldron kept himself unmolested. Termites carried off his laptop, but he took it all on his featureless chin. At night he dreamed of placid Idaho, where the thing men feared most was an outbreak of potato worm. Before he returned back home and left Australian shores, there was a barbecue for his departure. It was at Max Candy's place. There was abundant coleslaw. Tasty meat sizzled on the hot plate. Bill Bickley, the PE teacher, stood guard with a shotgun, just in case dingoes caught the scent. By this time, the faculty were resigned to Waldron's weirdness and asked him questions about the moon hoax and the role of the CIA. He seemed reluctant to discuss it. "It has certainly been an education," said Brian of the Triangles, giving a collegial opinion. Buzz was the first American he had ever met in detail. He had no idea they were so nervous. The afternoon went south when the barbecue was invaded by swarms of thrip, but not long before Buzz thanked his host and said it had been rustic and full of creepy memories. "I must admit," he said, "when I first came here I didn't know what to expect. The only Australian I knew much about was Crocodile Dundee," he joked. There was a long Antipodean nothingness at this. "Who?" everyone asked. Phillips from Geography, having someone hold his beer, gave a short speech in reply in which he said that even though the astronaut was a complete phony and the famous spacewalk was done with mirrors and trick cameras in Hollywood, it had been a pleasure to work with him, and everybody said, "Hear, hear." Another plump moon, shining in the south-facing sky, hung accusingly untrodden when Waldron caught the train to Adelaide again. That morning he had an encounter with a goanna in his kitchen. When he came in for breakfast, it was cold and humorless upon the kitchen floor. It was 7 foot long and hissing with primitive hunger. "By the prissy locks of George Washington," Sleepy Waldron did to cry. He had almost stepped on it. "What in the pale blue Jesus is that?" When Triangles came to drive him to the station, he chased it away with a broom. "Did you check your luggage?" he asked the American in the car. "For what?" asked Buzz. "Well, redbacks," said the Triangles. "They seem to like luggage. It happens all the time." There were cases, he said, of flights out of Sydney overrun with swarms of redback spiders 20,000 feet over the Pacific. Nested as it was in a twisty meander of riverland, the town seemed as cordial and intact as the flyleaf of a Reader's Digest. The countryside seemed as innocuous as a watercolour. The Australian sunshine seemed almost perpendicular and inviting. The weatherboards were nifty, but in every cranny lurked the miscreants of God's improper candour. The people were friendly enough, enduring the wild assaults of laconic indifferences and tolerant of fallen Americans. In the end, Buzz was happy to be going home without having lost an eye or an arm. As the train pulled out and crossed the many bridges of the namesake, Buzz read the newspaper of the man across from him in the carriage. "Hair Bear attack," said the headline. "American scalped in Tasmania."